pepper and oregano buttercup squash soup, not butternut, but buttercup squash soup. And then we're gonna make a pork chop sandwich with kind of a smoky barbecue flavor to it with some caramelized onions and on our leftover focaccia from last night. And then we're gonna make some pecan snowball cookies, which are one of my favorites from when I was a kid. But let's start by getting our onion sauteing up for our soup. We're gonna actually use 1.5 onions in here, and then the other bit of onions are gonna go on our sandwich. We've got some yellow onions here. I'm just gonna take off this whole top layers because they're just chewy and it's not worth the work to try to peel off all that brown part of the onion. And we'll dice these up and we'll get them sauteing. And then we're gonna dice up we're gonna cut our buttercup squash in half. And part of it I'm gonna roast in the oven so that I can have some squash for later to use in meals. And then we're gonna actually saute up for our soup today. And we're gonna do like a blended soup kind of disc for it, which will be lovely. And again, we'll do part of this onion and we'll save part of it for later. That way we have a lot of great onion flavor in it. Our soup, because again, it's just gonna be really squash, fresh oregano, black pepper, onions, really bringing up those flavors. And you don't have to dice super small for this because we are going to be pureeing the soup, so they can be a little bit bigger. Let's get our little bit of olive oil heating up in our Dutch oven here. About a tablespoon or so, enough to kind of coat a really thin layer on the bottom of your pan. We're gonna put our onions in. We'll give that a stir in just a second. So I'm gonna roast up, we're gonna use part of our buttercup, so not a butternut, buttercup squash. And then I'm gonna just roast up a pumpkin as well, so I have some homemade pumpkin puree because they are ready to go there. So I'm gonna essentially cut them in half so that I can just lay them on the baking sheet upside down so they can kind of create a little bit of a seal in there. But this is a pumpkin pie pumpkin, which is a little bit different than decorating pumpkins. But you can technically roast up decorating pumpkins. They're just not as nice of a filling for it. I'm a very seedy guy. And you could keep the seeds if you want to, but I'm going to scrape mine out or scoop mine out. I've got a couple pumpkin seeds on the ground. I swear this one has probably like over 100 pumpkin seeds in it. It's funny, so typically when you're carving your pumpkins, you get the bigger pumpkins and they have a lot less seeds in them. And these little ones, they always surprise me how much, especially pie pumpkins, how much they have in them. So we're just gonna kind of clear out the guts here. And then we'll get rid of these seeds. The buttercup squash doesn't have quite as many seeds as this one. And that way we can roast it up and then we'll have this nice kind of roasted pumpkin flesh for it. Right, and my trash can right here so I can get our first layer down. And then we're gonna do this. Let me wash my hands because I'm slimy and I don't want to slip with my knife. And so here is, you've probably seen these in the store. These are buttercup squash. So they're different than a butternut. They are actually a much denser and richer squash. And they make a really lovely soup in the sense that you don't need as much of the base to get it because you're gonna actually dilute it with a lot of liquid for it because they are thicker and denser. So I'm gonna kind of cut it through the middle. They're not the easiest ones, but because I'm gonna roast it, this is kind of the way I wanna cut it. And so I just kind of slide it in there and cut around. You could also just roast it whole if you want to, and then scrape out, but since I'm gonna use part of this in our soup, we're just gonna do it this way. There we go, but look, compared to the pumpkin flesh, this is a very rich, deep colored flesh. It's also much denser than the pumpkin, which means when you use it for a puree, you're gonna add more liquid to it. We're gonna scoop out our seeds. So again, a lot less seeds than the other one. And half of this is going to make a big pot of soup because that's just how much you get out of it. Because it is a very thicker one. So just think about like with sweet potatoes. If you've ever used sweet potatoes in a soup, they're just a thicker one, so you put more liquid to thin it out. Okay. We're gonna put these on here because we're gonna roast these up for later on there. Let's see, I'm gonna use the smaller one for our soup because again, a little goes a long way. And then we'll pop these in the oven later when we bring, well, you know, we can pop them in now, that way they can start cooking, and you can probably, by the end of this stream, you'll see how soft and delicate they are for this. Roast them upside down like this. It traps the moisture in them and allows them to cook a little faster. I'm gonna put them on our top right here, and then we might move them around when we do our cookies and put them a little bit lower for it. But let's get our squash cut up and start working on here. I'm gonna give my onions, I'm gonna turn it down to about a 5 now, and then I'm gonna give them a little bit of a stir and kind of coat them up. And then we'll get this squash in there to saute as well. The onions are starting to get to my eyes. Okay, for this, there really is no great way to cut this up as best you can. So we're just gonna kind of first work and break it down into more manageable pieces. And then I'm just going to kind of get a little bit of that, work on that a little. I think it'll be easier if I break it down smaller. And we're gonna get some of that skin off of it. Because the buttercup squash skin is a very chewy, tough skin, so you can't really keep it in there because it will be tough on your soup. Just find a way that's going to be safe for you to hold your squash, and then just cut it slightly down like this. A peeler does not work well with this, so you really just have to do it with your knife, but it's not that difficult. So we'll get this, and then we can get it sauteing. But a little bit of this goes a really long way. So you can see, just working along. And I feel like we're gonna do our soup today. It's just gonna pair really well with our sandwiches. So last night for dinner, we made our penne pasta with our Wagyu beef and Italian sausage meatballs with Parmesan cheese in them. And they were delicious. The Wagyu beef was actually, you can get it from Costco, but it makes for even more tender meatball than I was actually expecting for it. So they were delicious, but we have leftover focaccia because I made a huge sheet of it because I like to use leftover focaccia to make sandwiches because it's a great flavorful bread. So I feel like that's just gonna work well. The pork chops I feel like are gonna pair well with squash too because pork has that kind of underlying sweetness. So I think it will really bring our lunch together. And then I was like, I haven't made a cookie in a while, so it's Christmas time. Costco has those like David meltaways, which are kind of like a snowball. They're similar, like a pecan sandy, but they're similar to the snowballs that I had growing up, and that's what we're gonna make today. Here, let's give our onions a quick stir. We're gonna let them get a nice kind of caramelization on them before we put our squash in there. And we're also gonna put in some cloves of garlic. But really the main spices in our soup today is gonna be our fresh oregano that I picked from my garden, black pepper, garlic, and onions. There. So just sliding it down. I find that if you make them a little bit thinner, you know, where you can hold them fairly well, you'll be able to chop this up quite easily. And then we'll get over it. And then for our cookies today, again, we're doing this kind of pecan sandy, you know, snowball thing. We're actually gonna make them in little balls. And you kind of dust them with the powdered sugar at the very end after they've cooled for about 5 minutes. You roll them in it, and that gives you that snowball things, but they'll have chopped up pecans in them, so you'll get a little bit of texture. But it's like a slightly sweetened shortbread with this nice, you know, crunch in there from it. There we go. I'm just gonna cut that stem off. And look at this. But these, I will say, they are a really reasonably priced squash that you can get from the store. They're often on sale because I think a lot of people aren't sure how to cook them, and they make really good. I make pumpkin, essentially a pumpkin bread, but a squash bread with them, and muffins. And you can use them in soups, but you get a lot for them. Now you could always, again, roast up your whole squash and then kind of use it in there, but there's nothing, I feel like when you make a squash soup, I do love a good sauteed squash. It kind of caramelizes the squash a little bit more than the roasting process and allows you to get a bit more flavor. Yeah, we're almost done with this, so not too bad. Okay, we've got our squash peeled. Woohoo! And then we're gonna cube this guy up, and we'll toss them in here in just a second. And we'll let them saute and simmer for a little while. So for it, it's a firmer squash, so it actually cuts similar to how like a sweet potato feels. You know, buttercup squash or butternut squash, which is that typically, you know, the long squash that's, you know, got a, you know, beige outside to it, is a much smoother squash. It has a higher water content in it, and it's a little bit easier to kind of cut through. These aren't quite as dry and starchy as a sweet potato, but they're kind of in that same family. These guys. And these are going to get tender a lot faster than, say, a carrot will get tender, or even like a potato, because they do absorb the liquid so well, because squash is a lot more spongy. So just small little cubing up like this. You don't have to go, you know, super big on it. The smaller, the faster you're going to cook it up and be able to puree it into a nice, delicious soup. Guys. And then we're gonna mince up some garlic to throw into our soup and let that saute for a second, and then we'll get our squash in there. We're gonna cook it for about 5 minutes before we add in any broth, because again, we want this squash to get that high heat from the bottom of the pan, caramelize a little bit, bring out that natural flavor before we start simmering it. But see, this was the smaller half of our buttercup squash, and just now that it's chopped up, how much we have is just, it's going to make a good amount of soup. Okay.
A question, do you make a lot of soups, and how many soup recipes do you have?
I love soups, and I've probably made hundreds and hundreds of different soup recipes in my lifetime. I do have lots of videos of soups that I've posted on our page. So there's, and I rarely repeat it unless it's one of my basic staples like chicken noodle soup on there, because I love just exploring different flavors with soups, or making like different takes on beef stew. So I have lots and lots of soup recipes. And then I have, for our members, I do have some recipe cards for a couple of the soups that I've made out there, like 10 or 15. Because again, soups are so delicious. I could eat a soup every day. I just love it. Soup and a sandwich. It's my happy spot. So I do have a lot of recipes on there. And, you know, I mean, during the summer, I don't make as much unless I do like a gazpacho or a vichyssoise, like a cold chilled soup. But fall, winter, spring, the colder parts of spring, I do make a couple soups each week. And I really try to change them up so you're not getting, I feel like that's the thing with soups, you can be so versatile and what ingredients you use, what spices you use, what flavors you use, that while you're having the base kind of, you know, a bowl with the thing in it, they have very different flavor profiles. Okay, we've got about a tablespoon of, you know, coarsely minced garlic in here. I'm gonna let it just toast up for about 30 seconds or so, get a little bit of that heat. Our onions, as you can see, have got a nice kind of golden brown forming on them. They're starting to caramelize. They're all about translucent. The smell is wonderful. So we'll get our squash in here and we'll let it start to saute. And I just wanted this to get kind of heat in here before we work on our cookies, because cookies don't always take hardly any time to make.
Do you sharpen your own knives?
I do sharpen my own knives. So when I got my knife set, when I got married several years ago, it came with a honing steel, and so I just use my honing steel, which is kind of looks like an épée, but like a little sword, and just like sharpen it up. It's really not difficult, and it only takes like a minute or two to sharpen up a knife. And I typically sharpen my knives every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on, you know, if I cut up something that makes them a little bit more dull, then of course a little sooner. But whenever my knives start to kind of slip on like an onion or a tomato or pepper, that's when I know. And I mean, I've had my knife for going almost 17 years and they're still going strong. So good quality knife can really take you far. Okay, we've got ours kind of toasting up here. We're gonna let that toast up. I'm gonna give my hands a quick rinse. We're gonna work on our cookies. So our cookies today are, again, a really simple, not very many ingredients in it. It's kind of a base shortbread, but we're gonna start with a cup of room temperature or softened butter and put them in our little bowl here.
You have a question? For someone just starting out, what's an easy soup to make?
For just starting out, a really easy soup, if you have a blender, would honestly like a creamy tomato basil. Those are very simple because there's not very many directions. I do have videos on how you make it, but it's a very simple soup that gives you a lot of flavor, a lot of comfort, and it makes you feel like you've accomplished a lot. But it's very simple in the ingredients. So that is a really easy soup because you just have to blend it or use an immersion blender after it. Chicken noodle soup is also a fairly easy soup. My only, recommendation is if you don't make your own noodles, you can get frozen noodles. They're called reams, and they're in like the freezer section. They are amazing for chicken noodle soup. So you don't have a soggy noodle in your soup. And use chicken thighs as your base for it. So those are like on the FNG. Now you can get very complex with soups and whatnot, but those are pretty good. I'm gonna start with, I've got a cup of butter in here, which is 2 sticks. We're gonna give it a quick little cream first, and then I'm going to add in a 1/2 cup of powdered sugar. But again, you want room temperature, kind of softened butter, so it's not too cold. And that's just going to allow you to cream it a little bit better. Now with these, I said they're very mildly sweetened on the base of the cookie. So we're gonna use about 1/2 cup of powdered sugar. But we are going to be dusting them in about 1 cup of sugar. Now, not each one will have it, but they'll be dusted. That gives you a bit more of that sweet flavor, which is kind of nice since they're not an overly decadent cookie, but great. You can do a hand mixer or a paddle mixer. works well for this. So we're gonna cream that until it's kind of nice and light and fluffy. Hand mixer goes a little bit faster than a paddle mixer, but it's about 2 to 3 minutes with your paddle mixer or a hand mixer. You can get it in a little bit less than a minute. You just go a little bit faster, whip some of that butter out. There we go. And then we're gonna add in 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla and then like 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. You need a little bit of salt, but we're primarily using salted butter. So if you aren't using salted butter, you're gonna wanna use a little bit more. So we're just gonna do about a pinch or so of salt, about 1/4 of a teaspoon. Because you need a little bit to kind of cut through. And then we're gonna do 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla, which is the same as a 1/2 tablespoon. Then I'm gonna give my soup, before we mix that up, I'm gonna give my vegetables that are sauteing a nice kind of stir over. Just kind of make sure you mix it all around. That way each squash gets its time on the bottom. As you can see, we're already getting some nice kind of caramelized edges and browning on there, that nice saute. Try not to stir it too much, but really coat it around, stir it, and give it a good minute to sit and rest. Okay, let's whip our vanilla and our salt into our cookie here, our base. There we go. And then we're gonna add in flour, and we'll add in some nuts too, but that is pretty much the base to our cookie. Very, very simple. We're gonna add in 2 1/4 cups of flour. So it is very much like a shortbread cookie on there, but we coated in some lovely powdered sugar to give it a little extra sweetness. So we need about 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour. 1, 2, and a 4. There we go. We're gonna whip that kind of into it, or mix it into it until it's just combined. You don't want to over mix it, because you don't want it to be too stiff. But it's gonna be a very thick dough. We'll kind of work it around. There's a little bit, there we go. And as the more you work it, the more it's gonna come together. And this is gonna give you just this really delicious shortbread cookie. Turn it up just a smidge. There we go. It's starting to come together now. And what we're gonna do is we'll roll these and shape these into a ball. Let's give this a second. We'll let it sit for a second, but as you can see, when you work it together right here, when we stir it, it's gonna form all the way together into a nice cookie base. My hands quick rinse. Overboard. There we go. And a little bit of onion. Beautiful. Okay. Before we kind of work in our next part, we're gonna chop up about 3/4 of a cup of pecan. So I already have kind of a coarsely chopped pecan, but I'm going to chop them a little bit more. You could put them through a food processor if you wanted on there, but you need about 3/4 of a cup. I'm just gonna chop them up in 2 batches because it gets a little challenging. I'm gonna give my knife a quick rinse so it doesn't bring over any onion flavor. And just make them smaller because you don't want to have super huge pieces of pecans in there, or it kind of takes away from the texture of your cookie. So you can pulse them through a food processor if you wanted to, or just grab your knife out and just chop them over until they're just a little bit finer than the chopped pecans that you get out of a bag. You could also use walnuts in this instead, but I do find that the pecans are just so lovely. I like my walnuts with chocolate, and my pecans, I feel like they can go with like the blonder type desserts. Okay, so that is we're gonna add a little bit more, but we'll get our first kind of part in there. I just find if you try to chop too many up at one time on a cutting board, they never quite get fine enough for you. And that should be close to 3/4 of a cup.
And how many pecans total?
About 3/4 of a cup chopped up. So chop them up and then measure it. I'm eyeballing it, of course, but you can get more precise. Don't measure before you chop, because once you chop it up, it's going to shrink down. So you'll actually need more than if you just measured whole. There we go. And then we'll get the other part, and that's about 3/4 of a cup. And it's plus or minus. You don't have to get too, precise with it. And then I'm just gonna go through and I'm gonna work this together with my hands. If you have a paddle mixture, you don't have to quite do it with your hands. It will form together on its own. With a hand mixer, you're gonna have to work it together with your hands to make that dough, because it whips it up a little bit smaller.
And what's everything in there?
So we have about 1/2 cup of powdered sugar, a cup of butter, about 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla, and 2 1/4 cups of flour. And then of course 3/4 of a cup of our chopped up pecans. And these are going to be our little snowballs. So we will be coating them in more sugar later, since they are like a shortbread base cookie. Here we go. So now we've kind of got our nice dough here for this. This makes about 2 dozen snowballs, depending on how big you make them. I'm going to grab my parchment lined baking sheet here. That way we can start kind of shaping them up. And you're just going to get about a tablespoon type size of them. You've got your little ball. And you're going to make them, and then you're going to give them at least, 2 inches apart. They're not going to like lay out too flat or anything like that, because they are a denser, shortbread cookie, so they pretty much keep their form fairly well. And we're doing them in the nice balls so that they'll be snowballs. But start with, the butter. You want a room temperature butter, because a cold butter will be really hard to cream everything together with. So it will just take a lot longer. And then you want your oven preheated to about 350 degrees, because these cook for about 8 minutes. If your oven intends to cook a little bit, lower there, it can take up to 10. Don't overcook them, because if you overcook them, they'll be dry, and you don't want them. You still want that butter to be nice and moist and tender kind of inside that cookie. It gives them that really rich, shortbready flavor to it. So we're gonna we'll get 12 on this one. You don't want to overcrowd on there, because again, you want that kind of space between each one so they really, have their spot. And it's a pretty easy one to shape up. You just kind of grab it and mold it together, it holds together well.
Do you make these during the holidays?
Mm-hmm. They're like the Snowball cookies that my aunt always made for us growing up. So we rarely ate cookies throughout the year, but at Christmas time was like cookie extravaganza at our house. And so we'd make our Swedish gingerbread cookies, so pepparkaka, and we'd make thousands of those. And I mean, I kid you, we had tins and tins because they last forever. They get better with age. So we would make a bunch of those. We'd spend a whole day making those, and then my aunt would make these, you know, chocolate chip cookies, peanut butter blossoms, like cardamom cookies, oatmeal raisin, every cookie you can imagine. We had in there in our little cookie tins.
Are you going to do a cookie bake-a-thon this year?
I am going to do a cookie bake-a-thon because part of our smorgasbord is we have a dessert table, which has all sorts of cookies and deliciousness. So I'm going to do a cookie-thon with all the cookies that we typically have at our holidays in there, which is a lot of cookies, and my kids are always love the cookie time. But we're gonna get these baking in our oven at 350 degrees again for about 8 minutes. I have my squash in there, so let me actually push my squash down so that we can get this up here. But we've got our pumpkin and our buttercup squash in here roasting that I'm actually gonna scoop out and make some purees for them. Use them for risotto, some muffins. I think perfect. Takes about 45 minutes to an hour to roast your squash, so it's something that can just happen there. But we've got these. Put them on the top. You don't want anything baking above them because you want that nice heat. And we're going to set the timer for 8 minutes. We'll take them out. We'll let them cool for about 5 minutes before we roll them in powdered sugar. And they make about 2 dozen. So I have a dozen there, and they make about 2 for it. Give our squash that we have. So again, we only put half of our buttercup squash in here. You can see it sauteing up nicely. It's starting to soften up. We are going to add in some fresh oregano, black pepper, and we're gonna let it start to simmer. So I went out to my garden and I picked a whole bunch of oregano to add to this soup. 'Cause I was thinking, I was like, you know what? I feel like black pepper and oregano is one of my favorite flavors on sourdough, and I just feel like it will go really well with the squash. So we're gonna do that. A lot of times I'll use sage because sage also pairs well with the earthiness of squash. But today it was like one of my few herbs that have made it through several freezes.
You have a question. What cookies did you say last forever?
Swedish gingerbread cookies, which are called pepparkaka, which are not like the American gingerbread cookies. They are a thin, almost like a spice cookie, and they actually get better with age, and because they're crispy cookies. They're thin, crispy cookies. So they're not ones that are like chewy that you want to eat right away, like a chocolate chip cookie. But their spices mellow out and blend together as well. So growing up, we would make them like the day or two, like 2 days after Thanksgiving, we would make them. And we'd spend all day rolling them out and cutting them and baking them and fill up tins and tins and tons of tins full of cookies. And we would still have them come January, and they were still delicious come January because they just need to be in an airtight container and they just really hold well. And I will say, I was like, you can't really find them here. I feel like there's a couple brands that make a pepparkaka, or they're called like Anna's Spice cookies that are, where you can buy them, but they're just so good homemade. And it's funny because it's an interesting way of making it, because you would make the dough and it sits on your stove overnight. You make it in a Dutch oven. It sits on your stove overnight because it mellows out, and then the next day, once it's kind of cooled and has sat there, you roll it out and you bake it. But I just remember growing up, as the dough would be sitting on the counter overnight, all of us kids would go through and we'd take the lid off of my mom. She had this orange Dutch oven, Le Creuset Dutch oven, and we would take it off. We would steal a bit of the dough. We put the lid back on, and there was definitely probably like a third less dough by the next day because it was such a delicious dough to eat. So we're gonna chop up our oregano. We don't have to go too crazy because again, we're gonna puree it, but you wanna have a couple cuts on those leaves so that they bring out their flavors. This is a good amount.
Is there butter in the soup or just olive oil?
Just olive oil. Now, I will use a little bit of cream when we blend it to give a bit of smoothness, but you want to keep it completely dairy-free. You can use coconut milk, like the canned coconut milk. Works really well to smooth it out a little bit. You don't need much cream, but I do find it just makes a more velvety texture. Okay, we've got our fresh oregano in here. We're gonna add in some liquid in just a second. We're gonna add in a little bit of black pepper. So about a teaspoon, because again, I want that black pepper to kind of pop a little bit. We'll give it a good mix up. You can see it's already kind of breaking down and just making the good base for it. Beautiful. And now we're gonna add in about 4 cups of water with a big scoop of chicken bouillon. You can use vegetable bouillon as well if you want to keep it vegetarian. We're gonna start by adding in just 1 cup, and then I want to slide around and scrape off any garlic or onions or spices that may have sunk to the bottom and have caramelized down there. And we'll mix it in. You're gonna need a good amount of liquid for this because this squash does absorb a lot and remains thick with a lot. And add in another cup, and I just go little by little until I get to the right kind of consistency that I'm gonna want, knowing that I'm gonna be adding a little bit of cream. If you use coconut milk, the can of it, you're gonna use about a cup less of the liquid here because you have, there's a lot more than one if you're gonna use like a heavy cream. Okay. Sweep it around. Add it in, give it a good stir. We'll do a little bit more. So we've got our whole 4 cups in here. And we're gonna let it simmer. I'm gonna put a nice big scoop of my chicken bouillon in here. We'll let it simmer. Once it's simmered for a while, then we'll puree it through a blender. You could use an immersion blender if you want. So we're gonna do about a heaping tablespoon. And we're gonna give it a good splash a little bit over. We're gonna give it a good amount. This is gonna give you the saltiness to your soup as well, so you shouldn't need to add much salt later, if any. That's just why I like it over just a chicken broth, because I can give a little bit more of that chicken flavor in there and a little bit more of that saltiness without having to dilute it too much. One more stir, coat it off of there. Now we're just gonna let that simmer on there for just a few minutes. While we do that, let's work on our sandwich on here. So we'll get our pork chop kind of ready for this. So we had pork chops and I had a couple left over in the things because when I buy them from Costco, they always come in this big, huge pack and I can never use them all there. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna fillet these and then I'm gonna hammer them out and make them a little bit thinner so that we can kind of put them. Here's my mallet. So I'm going to fillet them through the fat part here. That way I don't have this big, huge fat vein in the middle of my sandwich. And you could always completely cut it off, but we're gonna just leave it on there to give it flavor. So I'm filleting through, but I'm actually butterflying. So butterflying, it kind of looks like a butterfly where you don't cut it all the way through. So it kind of keeps your pork chop as one big whole piece. This guy's quite fat, but I love a good, when I'm making pork chops like with dinner, a good thick pork chop just keeps it nice and juicy and tender all the way through. So we're gonna kind of just, and I'm just kind of cutting against the grain on here, trying to almost saw it a little bit so that it breaks up those fibers in the pork chop, which is going to make it more of a tender meat on it. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna pound these guys out. But let's go look at it. Grab our cookies out, and then we're gonna pound them. Get my hands a quick rinse. And we're gonna grab our cookies out. Remember, these need to sit for about 5 minutes before we can roll them, because you want them to kind of keep their form. But here they stay cute little snowballs that we will coat up with flour. And as they sit on our tray here, it's nice and hot, it's going to continue to cook. So I'm gonna grab the tray real quick. That way I have a place to put it. And then, once they've cooled down enough to where we are able to touch them and work with them, we will roll them or kind of dust them with powdered sugar. Because you want to be kind of gentle with them on there. But they are like, if you've ever had a pecan sandy, I always roll them the balls. They're snowballs because you coat them in that powdered sugar. But they have vanilla, butter, powdered sugar, and pecans, and a pinch of salt in there. So again, just a really simple and delicious flavor to it. Okay, let's get our pork chops pounded out. This is gonna make it tender, and we're gonna allow it to kind of cook up nice and fat. So this is a meat tenderizer, which is essentially like a hammer for meat. You know, I didn't have one of these for like 15 years, and then I made fried pork tenderloin sandwiches all the time. I was like, I've got to stop using my garlic press that I would wrap up in like plastic wrap and hammer it out. So I finally was like, we're gonna buy one, and I got it. But it helps tenderize the pork up, because pork chops is a kind of a leaner bit of meat, and it can get a little bit tough. Now, I'm not gonna necessarily cut mine super thin or pound it super thin, because I do want a nice kind of meatier part on our sandwich. And hammer out both sides, because that's going to make it nice and tender. There we go. Beautiful. Wash my hands. We'll get these guys seasoned up, and then we're going to start sauteing them off. Now, I'm going to do a very simple kind of smoky barbecue seasoning on here. Kind of go with our sandwich that we're going to make. So a little drizzle of Worcestershire. This is going to help keep these pork chops nice and juicy and flavorful. Got a little bit of liquid smoke. Little goes a long way. So I always pour it in my cap first, so that I can be a little bit more even about dripping this over, because you really just want drops. You don't want a whole lot, because it's got a thing. But it's gonna give you that smoky flavor for it. Then we're gonna do a little bit of onion powder. We'll coat this up. And then I have a little bit of paprika, because again, I kind of want this kind of smoky barbecue flavor. And a little bit of seasoned salt. And then we're gonna flip this over, and we'll do everything on the same side except the liquid smoke. I only do liquid smoke on one side because, again, the liquid smoke is pretty powerful in the flavor. Let me get that, we'll season up. But while we're waiting for this to season up, I'm gonna turn on my skillet over here so that we can start heating it up with some oil in here to saute those pork chops off. They're gonna cook up fairly fast because we hammered them out nice and thin. And then we'll be able to build our sandwich with them. We'll get our soup pureed, and we'll get our cookies rolled out. Again, a couple little drizzles of Worcestershire. That acid in there is going to break down the kind of the fat in the pork chop and make it nice and tender. The onion powder is going to give this nice little golden kind of crustier on it, which is going to give it a lot of flavor while giving it a good kind of sear. Paprika is going to kind of go in that nice kind of, gets us in that barbecue flavor to it. Good little sprinkle. And then my Lowry seasoned salt. Nice sprinkle over. Okay. I'll let that sit there for a second. Once our pan is nice and hot, we are going to get those going. I'm going to give my soup or my squash here a quick little stir. And I'm going to grab a spoon and kind of taste my spices, see how that thyme is coming out, that fresh thyme, see if I want to add, or not thyme, oregano, my fresh oregano, see if I want to add any dry to help it out. We'll see. I think I've got a good 1/4 of a cup, if not more, in there. Don't need to, but I am going to add a little bit more chicken bouillon. Here's my chicken bouillon spoon. Needs a little bit more. I will say the squash can kind of dull out a little bit of that because it is such a base. So I'm gonna add just a smidge more. That way we have the right kind of saltiness to our stew. Our stew. Okay. Now let me see. I think I'm gonna get a drop of water, test it, see if it's nice and hot. You don't want to cook your pork chop on a cold pan, so you want to make sure it kind of sizzles. You need a little bit more time, not quite there yet. Let's get a bowl ready for our cookies here. You can see they're nice and dense. They're firm, so they're not like, you know, moldable like before. But we want to roll them in the powdered sugar so that they'll be ready. Here. Turn my soup down just a smidge. And you need about, because again, we're going to be kind of rolling it, and you need more powdered sugar than you're actually going to end up with, but you want enough to kind of coat each one. So we're just going to put a whole cup in here, but knowing that we're not necessarily going to get through the whole cup with it.
You have a question? Do the kids like the soups?
They do. I will say my boys are lovers of soups. My girls, they're more picky on which soups they like, but they do all like the soups. I think that's because they've been eating soups ever since they were little, so they've really enjoyed it. Teddy he always loves soup on there, and so is Torn, my little things. And Jack, you know, he's at that age, he just eats whatever you put in front of him. You know, I will say, and you know how kids are, they go through their stages. I said, they go through it where they eat everything, and then they don't eat anything, and then they get back to eating everything.
Yo has a question for you.
What's for dinner tonight? So tonight, I believe we're actually going to get to make the pork belly and naan sandwiches that I had wanted to do last night before all of my kids' sports decided to change schedules. So we're going to have that for dinner tonight. And we're going to take our little snowballs here, and you're going to just coat them up. And voila, we've got a nice little snowball. Very festive. Again, that's why I say it adds just the right amount of sweetness to them, because again, this dough only has a 1/2 cup of powdered sugar in the base of it. So this is just kind of like, you know, when you do a glaze on a scone, it adds just enough. And of course, they're so cute. These are always, you know, and it's so funny because I feel like snowballs, a million cookies go by the term snowballs. And so these were always like the ones that I had kind of growing up, which it took me, you know, a long time. Every time I'd be like, oh, they're snowball cookies, and then they weren't snowball cookies on here. So these are like snowballs, but I also feel like they're just very similar to a pecan sandy, except you make them like a ball. And get these dusted up. We'll flip our pork chops here. We'll get our soup going. We'll probably pop in another batch of the cookies on here. But these are just a really quick and delicious cookie that you can make up in their time, and they're just so cute. They're perfect for like a cookie box too, because they hold themselves really well. Okay. So here is our first batch of our cookies here. I'm going to go give my hand a quick rinse. Come on here. I'm going to put these by these, but they're still warm, so I'm warning the cameraman. Okay, let's see how our pork chop sandwich. Ooh, beautiful. Look at that. Nice golden sear coloring on there. That's from that paprika and that onion powder is just wonderful. Let me grab my bread knife here. And we're going to get our focaccia going for our sandwich. So last night we had, I made this huge sheet pan of focaccia. I kind of made a bigger one so that we could have some left over for our sandwiches. So we did a really simple, this was a hybrid between a sourdough discard and yeast. And then we seasoned it with basil, oregano, Parmesan cheese, garlic salt, and a little bit of black pepper so that it would just have this wonderful, nice season to it. Because I've got a thinner one, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut off a little bit of each one, and we're going to use this to make a really big sandwich that we'll put our pork chops on with some cheeses and give it a kind of a quick melt in there. But I like to cut off the bottom so that when you're eating your sandwich, it's not as tough or dry on there for that base part. So just a really thin kind of coat off, so you're not actually losing too much of your bread, but it's just going to expose the nice spongy part of your focaccia. Now sometimes when I make a sourdough ones, I make a really thick one where you can just cut that through the middle. But I stretched this one out a little bit thinner because my daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, she loves eating really just the top part of the focaccia, and it's always so funny, but she'll go through and she eats like the whole top half of it, and she'll eat like a whole fourth of it. And I'm like, you gotta eat the bottom. She goes, but I just want all the tasty seasonings on the top. So we'll get this kind of toasted off here. And we're gonna put it in here. We're gonna put our cheese on top of this. I'll pop it in my oven to start to melt, and then we're gonna get our sandwiches prepped up. We're gonna use a mixture of Gouda and some mozzarella cheese for our sandwich. So we've got, and I think I can do half and half because it looks like I'm gonna have the perfect amount to divide this through. Good. And we're gonna want that nice kind of cheesiness on both sides. And you could use all mozzarella, all Gouda. You could also use Havarti, provolone, Munster. You're gonna want to use like a white cheese versus one like a cheddar, because cheddar's got a bit of a stronger flavor to it. Pop this in half here. There we go. We're gonna go pop this in the oven and let that kind of cook. I'm gonna just check these real quick, see how they're looking. Beautiful. We've got this nice perfect sear on both sides. Excellent. And then we're gonna get those off, and I'm gonna turn those off. Perfect. And those will be ready to go on here. So we're gonna melt up the cheeses on here. Again, you can take a nice peek at our squash, our pumpkin, and our buttercup squash roasting for some puree that we're going to make later. We're going to get this toast set up here. We're going to get our pork chops pulled off. We'll saute up our onions, and then we'll pull those out. We'll blend up our soup, and we'll be ready to serve up our lunch today. Beautiful. Gorgeous. Okay. I'm gonna have my pork chops rest right here. That will go on our sandwich. Using our little drippings in our pan, we're going to saute up our onion strings, or sliced up onion. I'm gonna do them in strips so that we can put those on our sandwich as well. And we're gonna cook them in those drippings so that they add a lot of great flavor. Add a little bit more olive oil in here, and we have all of those spices and seasonings are in here, so they're gonna add a nice kind of amber brown color to the onions.
You have a question? What are you doing to the squash in the oven?
So I am roasting it up so that I can scoop it out, kind of mash it, add a little bit of liquid, but then I can use it to make pumpkin muffins, pumpkin bread, buttercup muffins, buttercup bread. I can make a risotto with it. It's just a great way to have a nice roasted squash that's a little bit better tasting than like the can, which works well for baking and in some of those savory things like a pumpkin risotto. Just delicious. Here, look at our onions are just coated in those nice kind of spices and those flavors. We're gonna let those caramelize up here. And then we're gonna puree up our soup here because we're just about ready for that. So I'm gonna slide this out of the way while I'm gonna let these kind of simmer. And we'll get our soup pureed and then we'll be ready to serve up. Okay, so we're gonna do ours in the Vitamix. Our squash is nice and tender. As you can see, it's already breaking down, which is perfect because you want it to be at a nice tender place. You don't want it to be firm when you go to blend it.
Are the onions still on?
They are actually just cooking on that residual heat. If your pan was still really, if it had cooled down, just do them over a low, like a medium-low heat. But my pan is still nice, so they're cooking through. I want them to get nice and kind of caramelized, lose a little bit of that whiteness so they're more translucent, but still keep their form. And I think they'll be wonderful on our sandwich. Okay. We're gonna scoop these guys in here. We'll puree them. And then our cheese on top of our focaccia should be melted. So we should be able to take that out and build our sandwich. See if I can carefully, without making too much of a mess, pour the rest of this in here. There we go. And then we're going to puree this up, and we should have a nice kind of a velvety broth soup stew, I should say, like a bisque to it. So I'm going to do my soup setting. We're going to start on lower, and then it will speed up after about 30 seconds, and then you need about 10 seconds left. That's all you need. I will say you can do this with an immersion blender. I just find that it's a little bit faster on here, but we're gonna have this nice, as you can see, it's got a nice thickness to it. So it's got this like a bisque almost. Beautiful. You can put it back in there. Gorgeous. And I'm gonna go grab our things because it should be just about ready. We can assemble our sandwich and we'll be ready to serve up our lunch here. So just a quick toss. Beautiful. Okay, I'm gonna go grab. Perfect. So here, as you can see, we've got our sandwiches perfectly melted. We're gonna get ready to assemble on here. And let me get ready. We'll get ready to assemble and ready to eat. I'm gonna build them. Let me grab my cutting board. And that way I can build it on here so I can cut, because these are gonna make a good size sandwich. And remember, this was our leftover focaccia that we used with last night's dinner. So it has a nice kind of Italian seasoning base on the crust. And then we have both Gouda and mozzarella cheese on here. Okay, I'm gonna make sure they're just perfect. Beautiful. We're gonna layer up our caramelized onions. Pop some, we're gonna do some on top and some on bottom so you get that nice kind of caramelized onions flavors throughout. We're gonna put our pork chop on here. So we have our filleted pork chops. Got them, beautiful. And then we'll cut these up into actual manageable size sandwiches when we go there. And we're gonna add our next layer of our onions on top of this. Kind of build up our sandwich for it. Beautiful. We're gonna drizzle a little bit of whatever barbecue sauce you love. I love the Sweet Baby Ray's. Don't go too much because you don't want it too saucy. But again, a nice little drizzle over gives you that perfect little thing. And then we'll put our top on and we'll be ready to serve this guy up. This is a huge sandwich that will be cut into fourths. So let's get ready to serve up our lunch. Get that. Let's get our soup cauldron. And, oh, my ladle's right over there, so I don't actually even need them. We'll get our cookies a little bit closer. Okay, for lunch today, we have our pork chop sandwich, which we made on our focaccia. We sauteed up a pork chop with our, seasoning and caramelized onions, Gouda on there, but you can see it there, a little bit of barbecue sauce. We're gonna have that with our lunch. Those flavors are gonna pair wonderfully with our oregano and black pepper seasoned buttercup squash, so not butternut, but buttercup squash. We made with, we got chicken bouillon in here, onions, fresh garlic. We simmered them and then we pureed them until this nice smooth bisque. And then of course, we will serve them with our Snowball kind of shortbread cookies, which have pecans in them, a little bit of vanilla, and then rolled in powdered sugar for a little extra sweetness. So just a little delicious treat. Well guys, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, kind of show you what we're making for our family and hopefully teach you guys something new. Again, we do upload all of our videos to the link on our page, so if you ever want to recreate any of these recipes at home, you can just go to our page and search for what we made. So we've got our black pepper and oregano squash soup with our Snowball cookies and our pork chop sandwich, and you can watch and cook along with me again. We also have a link to our Amazon storefront that has all of our different cooking gear and gadgets. I've got my Dutch oven, I've got my Vitamix in there, my knives, my cutting boards, all the different things that I use in the kitchen I have in there for you guys to check out. But again, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like